I am going to do a review of how we came to be where we are today. About the thing that is everywhere, it's like the air we breathe now, but we often don't really ask how and why and what of it, which is the market, right? And whether it is rural development or urbanization, SDGs, human rights, livelihoods, well-being for all, none of this is going to get resolved without reference to what is happening to the market. History begins with settled agriculture. I'm going with that assumption. We all know that as a species, we are in this form for about, say, maybe 1,00,000 years, roughly they are estimating, maybe little more. But that is, we can call that period prehistory because it is actually there in our memory. I mean, for example, much of the ancient religious documents, whether it is the Old Testament, maybe not the Old Testament so much, but definitely the Rig Veda is carrying the memory of period perhaps from before settled agriculture. But for our purpose here today, we are going to begin with settled agriculture, and I am going to stay with this figure. Even though we now know, and though this is not, textbooks have not been modified, the people who are in these disciplines of anthropology and archaeology are telling us that actually the first settled agriculture happens in 12,000 BC, and it happens in Latin America, not the Mesopotamian civilization. So both for the Middle East and for us, which is the Indian subcontinent, Harappan, etc., it happens here. The half point then, between then and now, is 3000 BC, okay? So for half the time that our ancestors have been doing settled agriculture, there is no market. There is no bazaar even. There is only what today scholars call gift exchange. Now gift exchange is not back present and happy birthday to you, but it is that all exchange happened in some kind of reciprocal and mutually beneficial or community related structures, not actually very different from when you go across to the neighbor and say, I want dahi. Mera dahi khatam ho gaya, I have to start making dahi. The next half point comes to about 500 BC. Now, somewhere between this period and this period, we begin to start having barter and various kinds of semi-commercial exchange. And they happen actually as a add-on to what is something far more fundamental to our species, which is that we have a need to gather. We are by nature group animals. And somewhere between this period and this period, or actually much closer, maybe from about 4000 BC, people start to gather in an organized way. Now organizations have started happening because by now some kinds of concentrations also start happening, even in agriculture. Oh, by the way, that's a big story, huh? The how and why of settled agriculture and how it changed who we are. So some forms of either worship related gathering or just what even today you can go to Madhya Pradesh and see the Bhagoria. Okay, people just get together to dance and have fun. And remember that because that is connected with what is going to become Wall Street, which is somewhere here. I'll come back to that. Now, somewhere between here and here, a regularized kind of periodic, it happens at some regular intervals, but it still comes together and fades, kind of exchange begins to happen, which today we still call the heart. Okay, it's called, here now we call it weekly market or whatever. But the first permanent retail shop in any form does not happen till about 750 BC. And the story of money I am doing separately, so I am not going to hold it here, but this is also around the time that the first coins appear. So, ab aap soch lo, okay, we are here, we are here, this is us today. So, you imagine how close it is to our present. Half of this is about 750 AD, and then half of that is about 12,000 something AD. So actually I am not even fitting on the page. That means now I have to break it up so minutely. So half of this will be what? Half of 12,000 AD will be about 1750. Okay. So our world that we live in now has actually been shaped around here. In 1600 AD, what happens in 1600 AD? Can somebody tell me why I picked 1600 AD? I mean, it changed the fate of our people. 1600 is the year that the British East India Company is set up. And it is only after 1600 AD that, I mean roughly that period, not exactly because the Dutch East India Company is set up in 1602 or something. And it is after between 1650 onwards or so roughly that the first stocks and shares start to be exchanged. And it's initially they are nothing but gentlemen's clubs or merchants, there was a practice in Western Europe of these sort of clubs or pubs. So very much like back here, that because people gathered for the dance, because they gathered to meet, to fall in love, to make matches, to worship, then they also thought, acha, I have extra, salt, you have extra oil, let us exchange it. That kind of thing happened. Same thing happens later on, that where people gather in any case to have a drink and hang out with their friends, they start exchanging their trading in stocks and shares. And even Wall Street is not born, doesn't take shape till about 1792. So really we are living in a world that was formed day before yesterday. I feel that my submission to you is that it's very important to bear this in mind. So how does it matter, how much time it took to shape something? For example, how does it matter that the cell phone was invented, say 20 years ago? Now it is what determines who we are. In the case of the cell phone, that may be a valid argument, but the reason why it's not so for the case for the market and bazaar is because in this whole narrative about the market, there are certain claims being made about what the human being is and what we are capable of and what is natural to us. That is what I want us to examine and challenge. 1754 BC, that Hammurabi's code happens. Now, why is that important? Because in Hammurabi's, which is supposed to be for the Western civilization, the first ever any kind of moral or ethical code is recorded. Okay? And it's important because in Hammurabi's code there is reference to indebtedness, which is of great interest to us because it shows that the problem of inequality is not created by the market, the modern market, which begins to happen from here, which, so this problem of inequity and indebtedness is not brand new because even so far back Hammurabi is trying to figure out some kind of ethics and norms for indebtedness. Now, one view of history is that all this indebtedness was due to war. That's a fact that when people lost, say one group or one tribe went to war against the other, the people who lost were enslaved. But actually a lot of slavery was because of what today we see in bonded labor in India. A lot of slavery was because of debt. That I owed you money, I was not able to pay it back, so my whole family become your slaves. This is why in the Bible, how many people know the Bible, the Old Testament and the idea of the Jubilee year? So in the Old Testament, which also the New Testament actually took on to some extent, that's why do we say golden jubilee? That's where the word comes from. The jubilee year was a principle which the Old Testament adapted. It may have been there from Hammurabi's time, I'm not sure about that every 50 years all debts were off. So what I'm saying here is that there is a problem, inequality has begun, there is a power problem in society, but society is setting rules to try to deal with it. So every 50 years everybody had to be free, it was a clean slate and then you start again. Now to what extent this was ever followed in any society I am not qualified to say, but the fact that the rule existed is important. And the first writing also happens somewhere between this period and this period, and it is notations, it's actually numbers. The first writing in the world is numbers, and they are numbers meaning they are inventory of things exchanged or traded, etc. Clay tablets. So then of course there is by somewhere here between this and say Christ, say let's say year 0, the Greek agora happens. That's very significant also because that again reinforces in much later, in very, if you look on this chart you will agree that the Greek city-state is modern, right? Because when we look in this frame, and the agora again reinforces that people basically have a need to gather. That Greek agora where Socrates sat and had his famous dialogues is actually a gathering place. It's addebazi. How many people know addebazi? Okay, it's people hanging out, doing politics, doing culture, storytelling and philosophy, and because they are there in any case then they do buying and selling. And sometime between all this, Aristotle has happened, and I'll bring that up later because it's going to be relevant later for what we are trying to do here. At about the same time, the Harappan civilization is also in the same cycle. Coins happen, weights and measure, that's another very big movement. Standardization of weights, all this happens in Harappa. We know much less about Harappa because the script has still not been deciphered. Now in India and in China there is no break. This cycle continues and various kinds of innovations and developments happen. So now I am just going to create a different one here. So in India and China there is no break. Say, let's say from 500, let's do a 500 BC. Because we know from the Buddhist texts that by the time of Buddha there is urbanization, there are cities, and cities where there is very intensive trade, buying, selling, production. And both India and China definitely from this period are actively connected to Europe and the north. I mean China is our north, for us north, and Europe. So much so that in the Roman period there is lament. Let's say this is the present. So till about BC, I'm not sure if I'll do this correctly, let's say till 1750 AD, India and China, I mean by 1750 AD, India and China are the production hub of the world. Is everybody familiar with this? That in 1750 we have some 75% of the goods manufactured in any form, from the simplest knife or sickle to every bolt of cloth, 75% is produced in India and China up till 1750. Okay, and the rest of the world is either buying from us or they are living at such a what shall we say, well, in a commercial sense primitive level, that they just have so much little. And it is just in a period of 100 years that this changes. By 1850 that situation has been reversed, thanks of course to our friends from the East India Company. And the reason why this whole sequence is important to us is that in India and China, a combination of purely commercial enterprise was overlapped with the old kind of bazaar culture which is there throughout the world. So how many people know the term Jajmani system? I'll give you a living example. It's not maybe literally Jajmani, but an activist friend of mine, when she went to work in Champaran district only 20 years ago, and she was, like in this sort of Gandhian spirit, so she washed her own clothes, she did her own cooking, washed her own vessels and everything. But the dhobi came and protested. He said, no, if you're living in this village, you have to let me wash your clothes. It's compulsory. You can't live here and not let me wash your clothes. So these were again reciprocal systems. By the way, much of our textile industry, our famous handloom textile industry worked as a combination of from old gift culture to barter to pure commercial. Everything was combined because it was a very long chain. One set of people picked the cotton, another set of people knew how to clean it, another set of people knew how to prepare it to put on the charkha. Then charkha people were separate, then the dyers were separate, the people who strengthened the dhaga. Dyeing was one process and giving strength to the thread was a separate process, and the weaver was a separate process. And then if that fabric was going to be done with some kind of chapa, if it was not a self weave, which much of our handloom is, right? The design is in the loom. But if it was a block print, then that was yet another set of people. Now yes, this and what came out of it at the end went into this marketplace, and it went from India to Rome to Greece, eventually to London. By 1700 it was going into the bazaars of London. But the production process was governed by social relations more than by pure commerce. Now, I'm not saying it was perfect. Please don't think that I'm saying it was perfect. But there were some inbuilt equations here which did carry certain protections. And this is what the Industrial Revolution changes. The Industrial Revolution and of course the rise of the market, these two things go together, right? They remove these various layers of social obligation and reciprocity and bring it all down to supply and demand. That's why what we are living in now is a world that is supposed to be run by supply and demand, because we are told that is more efficient and more egalitarian than anything that has gone before. That is basically all that which has taken shape roughly from about 1750 to now. Isn't it interesting that it is also the period between which we are made kangal, where this subcontinent is made destitute. So now let's overlap this overall picture with the story of money, because that's very central to our exploration today. Now, as you said, somebody said earlier, after gift there was barter, in which there was no need for money. But by somewhere between this, maybe even before Hammurabi, forms of tokens of exchange come in. How many people know the two functions of money? Money has two roles. Basically, the first function is as a token of exchange. It helps, because the problem with barter was that now I say that no, my this much oil is, my 1 kilo of oil is worth your, half kilo of your spice. And he will say no. How do we decide what is, to do the equivalence? And also there was the cumbersomeness, that I have to carry so many sacks of my grain to the market, etc. So it was first was token of exchange, the other was store of value. Now in this there is a very interesting evolutionary problem, which is what actually today we are still in. My hunch is that is in some ways the crux of our Promethean dilemma. Everybody knows Prometheus, right? From the guy who stole fire from the gods. He was the Greek fellow. So here the dilemma is like this. I suspect that right up to even this Hammurabi's time, all wealth, actually much after that, but I am saying pretty much definitely till then, all wealth is stored in real things. So why do we say capital? Has anybody ever thought why we use the word capital for monetary resource, for money? Capital, when we talk about investable funds, we call it capital, right? Why do we say capital? And why do we also use the same word for hanging someone or cutting off their head? Why do we say capital punishment? Because it goes back to the Latin word for head, capitis, head. All wealth was measured in the heads of cattle that you could say were in your command. So all wealth was measured either in the heads of cattle or the bundles of grain, bushels. All this began to change from the time when we moved wealth into coins. Now, interestingly, the original reason for paying interest is organic. You had so many sheep. I borrowed some from you. I borrowed 4 sheep from you. And in my custody, or while they were being used by me, the 4 sheep became 6 or 7. So when I return to you, it seemed only fair and right that I don't give you back 4 sheep, I give you back 5. Same with grain. Suppose I borrowed 1 bushel from you and I planted it. That 1 bushel became say 100. So I don't give you back 1 bushel, I give you back 2 or 3. It seemed only fair. Because that which was borrowed multiplied. Borrowed ho ya invested ho. Right? It multiplied. It physically in the ecosystem of nature grew. But that doesn't happen with coins. If I borrow 2 gold coins from you, I can keep them from now till the kingdom come, but they are going to be only 2 gold coins. This is why the Semitic religions, particularly Christianity and Islam, made it a sin, a pap, to charge interest on this coin wealth. Actually, the Judaic tradition also has the same rule, but the Jewish people applied the rule somewhat differently for other people. That's why they tended to become the money lenders of the world. They said they interpreted over the years the rule to mean that it is a sin for a Jew to charge interest to a fellow Jewish person, but they can charge it to people outside the community. And this departure is very central to the process that we are now going to move towards. By the way, the earliest banks are in Greece. But they are born and they die. Then there are some various kinds of commercial markets and bazaars and other commercial transactions develop in Rome, but they don't last the fall of, they don't survive the fall of Rome. And so Western Europe literally falls into a marketless society after the collapse of Rome. So it is only in the 12th century or so, that's why I put down 12 AD, that gradually between 11th and 12th century AD that these periodic markets begin to gradually revive in Europe. But this doesn't happen to India and China and Persia. We have an uninterrupted growth of commerce and culture, which today people are talking about as the Great Silk Route. It's called the Silk Route because silk was one of the currencies that was used on that route, not because it was the only thing that was traded. Now the reason I'm going into this whole history is that in all of this, pretty much, social, moral, ethical rules or concepts were the basis of the commercial exchange. Even in Europe, when these markets were revived in the 12th, 11th, 12th century, there were rules made by whoever the local ruler was, whether he was a local duke or he was a local archbishop, because power still remained very largely in the hands of church organizations. And in India, certainly that was true. Whoever the local Raja was, he made rules. Rules that were meant to give everybody a chance. Now, that doesn't mean everybody got an equal chance. But in most societies, the person who came, the primary producer, the peasant, who came with his few, like one small cartload of his surplus to sell in the market, he was treated differently and with a kind of, kya kehte hain, with a certain special privileges that were not given to the commercial merchant. Yeah. So the merchant class was always, so jo aaj hum kehte hain na, organized and unorganized. That was not the distinction, but the professional merchant was treated differently, he was taxed differently from this primary producer. And this remained true for large parts of India even through the colonial period, except for areas where zamindari, was established in a very brutal way. The crux of this I would convey through this thing that was said to a friend of mine by an activist in Bihar, and I've used this quotation in my Bazaars book. He said, see, पहले अनादि काल तक समाज होता था, खाली समाज होता था, और उसके बाद दूर पे कहीं सरकार होती थी और थोड़ा बहुत बाजार होता था. फिर ये कलोनियलिज्म, अंग्रेज आए तो सरकार समाज के ऊपर ज़्यादा, समाज से स्ट्रॉन्गर सरकार हो गई, समाज दूसरे दर्जे पे आ गया. और ही सेज अब जो ज़माना चल रहा है, ये आज़ादी के बाद बाजार सब कुछ है और सरकार उसके बाद में है. ही मेंट दिस लास्ट 25 years, दिस सो कॉल्ड लिबरलाइजेशन पीरियड. और समाज को तो अब कोई पूछता ही नहीं. Whether we are addressing the challenges of the urban or the rural setting, my submission to you is that this is the crux of the matter. Can the bazaar as an organic entity be restored, or at least some of its principles reinforced? Or is the rule of supply and demand to be so final and pervasive and all consuming that who we are as social beings is either irrelevant or completely subordinate to the logic of supply and demand? Oh, by the way, there's a very interesting thing there, I forgot to tell you, but because it was part of the coin story. The Egyptians did something quite amazing. Even in the Pharaonic period, they managed to turn grain into a form of currency. Okay, how? See, now it's very fertile. You had tons, at one point in the year, you had far more grain than you could handle. And so they created state granaries, which were able to protect the grain, and they gave you a token. Say they gave you a scroll on that date for say 100 units. And when you came back, with every month, the units would decline. Why? Because even in the best form of storage, there will be some wastage. So what, say if you left with them 100 units of wheat, by the time you came back in 9 months, it would be about 90 or 92 units. And that's a concept which today is known as demurrage. This is one of the ways that even in the 1900s, people have tried to solve the problem of money, saying that maybe it should reverse mein hona chahiye. That instead of it multiplying, currently the thing is that if I have lent you 100 rupees, in 1 year's time you have to give me 107 rupees. Whether you're a bank or you're a, I mean, if you're in fact, if you're a private money lender, then you demand 150 for every 100 rupees lent. So instead, many advocates of justice have said that money's value when it is lent should be declining, which by the way is an interesting Hindu concept also. In Hindu tradition, it has been argued by, at least this is a Gandhian interpretation, by some of the Sarvodaya workers. It goes like this: the ability to multiply money, that is to grow, build on assets, is a very special skill. If you, for example, or rather I have, say, extra 1,000 coins that I am not able to invest, for me to bury it under my mattress is a sin. वो पाप है. Why? Because the dharma of money is that it must be kept in circulation. So hoarding is a crime. Even ayashi is considered better than hoarding. Meaning, you know, the person who throws it, whatever, on liquor or other forms of complete ostentation. Apparently even that was not so much frowned upon as hoarding. Chinese came up with paper money apparently around 11th century BC, but they never used it. I mean, it was given up. I have not studied why, whether it was given up out of wisdom, because they understood or they realized that there is a problem here, or for some other governance issues. How it happens is that firstly the Bank of England is created, and it's created because the king is in a problem. It's fighting a war with France, he doesn't have money, so they have to find a way to generate money, generate resources, sorry, and that is done by creating these notes of promise. Kenneth Galbraith has a famous quote where he says that, you know, money is such a important, big thing in society that its creation should have some more mystery to it. It's actually very sort of simple. And this gave eventually rise to the note that we know today. This what the Bank of England began to do in order to help out the king. I mean, the king only created the Bank of England. This is a very important moment in the creating the present. Now I'll come to the anecdote that explains what kind of conflict it gave rise to. So when the American rebels, right, were fighting for freedom from the British crown under the leadership of George Washington, how do you fight a war? You have to have resources. So they issued these, what they call sort of revolution notes. They invited people to invest, to, you know, give money not as a donation, but as an investment in this project of a free America. And they were given documents. They were basically they were given, it was kind of like a credit note actually, which the Revolutionary Army used to fight the war. Now when the war was over, when it was won, certain people in the ecosystem spread the rumor that, you know, this is not really a government. What is it? It's a ragtag, depleted army. They are never going to be able to repay you. So if you have, so for example, I came to you and said, so you give $100 to this, you're holding a note of $100, I'm telling you it's going to be only paper. But I will give you 50 if you give me the note. This is also the period in which God as the basis of morality, or church, or your priest, or the Bible, or any part of the Bible, Old or New Testament, being the guiding force, all this is already in retreat. Gradually in stages through the 1800s, the Catholic Church reverses its position on usury. Usury was the word, they had no other word for giving interest. You see, today we make a distinction, right? We think interest is what is legitimate, like 6%, 7% we call interest, And what that money lender in the village is charging, 50% interest, that we call usury. So, in the Catholic Church, the distinction was not there, and it was considered a sin. But over a period of 200 years, in stages, not at one go, through incremental changes, the church changes its position. And the idea of usury is dropped, and that becomes a very big factor in the rise of modern banking, which is based entirely on the idea that money must multiply through interest. Islam's argument is, to me, a very sound argument, that when you invest in a business, you can invest in a business, that is legitimate, which means what today we call equity investment. You share in the profit, you share in the loss. So, go in with your eyes open, do your, due diligence is the term today, and make a knowing choice, make an informed choice, and then if you benefit, you benefit, if you lose, you lose. Either way, it's yours to live with. But if you say, I am just giving you money, you may do what you like. In 1 year's time, I want 1.10 back. I am giving you 1, I want 0.10 back. 1 and 0.10. This act of separating yourself, your responsibility from the risk, but claiming right to the profit, is haram. This is the Islamic position. The Western Christian world decided that this old biblical view is anti-dynamic, and we can make much more progress if we keep money in circulation on a much faster and a much larger scale through interest bearing systems. So, it is in this context that Adam Smith is asking for the basis of moral values. And actually the work that he considers important is the theory of moral sentiments. Just day before yesterday, I saw this in Dadar. The man's body is his shop. Okay, he's standing on the side below the footpath in Dadar near the station. At his feet is a pile of nimbus, lemons, and in each hand he is holding like 5, 6, as many as that's it, and that is his dhanda. Okay. We have been taught that when we bargain with somebody, that is very lowly behavior, and that's why many shops take pride in saying fixed price. But traditionally, this process of negotiating is a part of the ethos. It's the strength that, and the premise is, and so now the Clue Train Manifesto, I would really urge you all to look it up. I think it still should be there online. It was written by a bunch of these complete kind of, counterculture to Silicon Valley people, all of them techies, all from the computer world, who saw in 99, they wrote this book in 1998, they saw even then that the internet age, the computer world, was potentially a return to conversation. Okay. They saw it as a return, that conversation which was killed when the market took over, and you only went to these, in America and in London and all, it is unthinkable. You walk into Selfridges or, Woolworth or something, there's no question of bargaining, right? That's considered very lowly. These are all fixed things. So they argued that the time, and it's from this book Clue Train Manifesto that I learned that phrase which I've used very often. I've attributed it to them in my book, that markets are conversations. And my research showed that in fact bazaars are conversations not just about price. Bazaars are traditionally the location for conversation about life. So one more thing that influenced me a great deal was the open source movement. Okay, how many people have heard of Tim Berners-Lee? He's actually the man who made the world we live in just now. He's the designer of the HTTP and the HTML protocols which made the World Wide Web possible. You've not heard of him because he's not a billionaire. He crafted these in the late 80s at a public institution in CERN in Switzerland, where he was a scientist. Linus Torvalds, anybody knows this name? Okay, good. वो तो because उसके नाम से हो गया. Okay, so Linus is younger, I think. He was a student at Helsinki University around the same time that Tim Berners-Lee was coming up. So one more person, little bit further back, Richard Stallman. अच्छा, क्या हुआ? Richard Stallman was a young recruit, क्या कहेंगे, student simultaneously at Harvard and MIT. When I was at college in the late 70s in the US, there was a special computer room, and you know, whatever, when they were teaching computer languages and all that, but you had to go to that room and, you know, like जैसे X-ray room होता है, like that. Now, at that time, most people don't know this, the programs were not private. All the computer programming didn't belong to anyone. It was open, it was shared, जैसे software कहते हैं ना, the coding. There was no ownership to that, the sequence of the zeros and one. Because there were only these big mainframe computers, that began to change the moment the desktop was invented, which is early 80s. And Richard Stallman was a student and then employee at this artificial intelligence lab, and he got very perturbed because suddenly he grew up in the sharing culture, okay, where and see, these are really serious and you know the right word, geek has a right meaning, which means a very passionate person. A geek is a person who is an expert in a field and very passionate about it. He was a serious geek. And he was horrified that suddenly all this software was being locked up. And he said, how can you grow good software? Grow meaning how can you create new software? He therefore in 1985 set up something called the Free Software Foundation. I've had the privilege of interviewing him. I like to show off about that. And he said it like this in the interview. He said, I had two choices. Initially, he thought I had two choices. I could either stand in front, I could join the people, because some people they took placards and they started standing in front of these companies that were doing privatized ownership, copyrighted software and, you know, protesting and doing hi halla. He says, or I could join one of those companies and, you know, become moderately rich and die a very bored and disappointed man. So he says, I decided to do neither. I realized that protesting would not get us anywhere and there was need for an alternative approach. So he co-founded, but mainly he led the Free Software Foundation in 85 or 86, and they created an alternative and independent licensing structure, which was called copyleft. But that term, he always says, is not something that, you know, he had invented. He says somebody once sent him a postcard in which he said that whatever I say here is copyleft. It's free. You can share it. It is the existence of that, what is it called? General public license, which allowed Linus Torvald, which gave him a structure upon which to build. Stallman and Free Software Foundation created many kinds of free software for large computers, but they had not got a breakthrough for the desktop. Linus's breakthrough was that he created an operating system, an OS, for the desktop. How did it happen? He was not working alone. It happened because he opened conversations with software programmers sitting in all corners of the world. Achha, these are the early net connected people. These are the earliest people who managed to be connected by internet before World Wide Web even came in. They were all using those edu addresses. Yeah, 90% of the servers that give us World Wide Web were running on open source software. And here I must make an official apology to Richard Stallman for using his name and open source in the same breath, because he gets very offended. This is a division that happened much later in the late 1990s, where a segment of this free software movement felt that Stallman's position was too purist, and that it should be possible to have, and they were also disturbed that in the public, people kept hearing free to mean giveaway, which was never its meaning. Free has three definitional points. Number one, the code of that software is freely open, it's open. So it was also, that's why they also wanted to call it more, they thought it was a more accurate name for the movement, open source. And you are free to change it. But you must then, change and modify the software. But the condition is that then what you put out must also have the code. In other words, if I take your software and I modify it and I lock it up, then it's no longer either free or open software. But if I also put it out in a way that shares the code, there is no problem. That is open and free software. And Richard Stallman, Bichara, kept saying, you can charge what you like for it. That's not the issue. But don't lock it up in order to make profits. So basically, the whole point of the World Wide Web is that it is a truly, that full big Maidan where the big Mela, it's for you. You wander about, no? And you see which animal you want to buy, which stall you want to go to, which nautanki you want to see, or which kind of jalebi you want to eat. It's a wide open space. And you have full choice, but that choice is not going to be there if somebody has actually, for example, removed bodily parts of the Mela and taken them to the next town 10 miles away. Then it's not part of the same. You don't have that access. The basic issue of our times, I still feel, is that on the one hand, you have a command and control tendency, which is what the champions of anti-net, those who want to undermine net neutrality are in the command and control mode. Whatever reasoning they may give for why and how it is beneficial, etc. And the opposite of that, he said, is the bazaar. Because the bazaar is a place of open conversation, open access, and open and equal choice. And the reason why all of this ties up with the much larger and more urgent, actually, aspects of our lives is that the bazaar model is also compatible with what Karl Popper called the open society. Now, an open society, he referred to, it's a term that he coined, to mean that social political context in which no one group can claim to have all the answers, the final answers, and then push them through by force if necessary. Okay, so in a sense, fascism is the most extreme example of the anti-open society. I personally think that what we are seeing just now, whether it is about films or other things, is a war against the open society. And by and large, the bazaar is a metaphor and also a actual literal manifestation of the open society. It will not be perfect. It will not always give you equality or justice in a way that we want. By itself. Those issues still have to be dealt with. I am not saying that the bazaar as a mechanism in itself will either deliver justice or equality. Even fairness will have to constantly be strived for. You will have to constantly, society and governance structures have to constantly work to ensure that fairness. Okay. There's another very interesting story here which is worth mentioning. So you all know the Xerox machine, right? So the Xerox machine is the work of one of the last garage inventors. Because the Xerox machine happened what? In the 50s or 60s. His name was Charles Chesterton or something. Under his inspiration, Xerox set up an entity called Xerox Park at Palo Alto, which is part of the Silicon Valley now. And it was a facility that was almost like an ashram, but except it was not an ashram in the spiritual sense, it was a sanctuary for the most intensely brilliant people, geeks, and they were given complete freedom. Play, just see what you want to invent. The mouse, the Windows interface, what finally made the Wi-Fi router possible, all of it came out of Xerox Park. And today, in fact, Charles is long gone, and now in fact the new generation of the Xerox company people are called idiots by the market. Okay, you were sitting on all this invention and you did not capitalize it. And the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs took all these ideas out of Xerox Park and made them what they are. So why is that story important? The reason I tell the Xerox Park story is that it proves that the desire for infinite profit is not the moving engine of invention. Madame Curie was not putting herself to risk and experimenting and giving us the X-ray in order to be a millionaire. She may be very happy to also be a millionaire, but she was not doing it because she was seeking the millions. People were all basically the inventors are driven by the desire to invent. And the fundamental premise of today's patent regimes is the opposite. And that's why, in fact, even the story of patents is a very important episode in the transition from bazaar to market, and I'll explain in a minute. In England, this story, by the way, you must see, is a beautiful book by a man called Lewis Hyde. So the story goes like this. There were very few lens makers for your binoculars in London. I don't know what century it is, it must be 1800s. And one fellow figured out what they were doing and he took out a patent on it, saying that this is my invention. The traditional manufacturers, and they were craftsmen, they went to court saying, no, we have been doing this for so long. How can he suddenly come along and say that this is his invention? And the court gave that man the patent on the following basis. They said the patent system is a way of rewarding the public sharing of information and knowledge. You had this knowledge, but you were keeping it secret in order to control the knowledge and therefore profit from it. He will also profit from it for a period, but after that it will be free and public. So the whole concept of patents was actually meant to ensure that the back story, in a sense the equivalent of code, the how of something is done, being in the public realm. Today, so I am saying that the original motivation behind that, the patent logic was still more in the bazaar space, because it was in favor of greater open sharing. Today, exactly the reverse has happened. So much so that in many fields, particularly pharmacy and also in agriculture, I am told that there is a crisis of innovation, because so much of the knowledge is in separate silos that scientists and innovators are not able to look behind it, and if they can't look behind it, they can't develop it further. So some people are deploying the philanthropic urge, and they are creating what they call creative commons or patent commons. And some companies that are more enlightened are doing it also, where they are putting out voluntarily putting things out into the common sphere, so that other people who want to develop things further don't have to reinvent the wheel. The Glaxo South Africa controversy, kya hua? This is long ago, almost like now 15-20 years ago, when HIV was still a very big and very new problem. Now, medicines have been found to at least manage the situation. So, Glaxo had a package, I think it was working out to $8,000 a year or something for the HIV drug, life-saving drug. And we were able to make it. Indian companies were able to sell it to South Africa for something like $400 a year. Okay. So the South African government started buying it from us, and I think some from Brazil. So Glaxo sued the South African government, saying that you can't do this. You have to buy it from us. It became a kind of international case. And then a whole swath of, I think even ActionAid was involved in this, Oxfam, ActionAid, many international NGOs and agencies ran a massive campaign to shame Glaxo. And that campaign included mobilizing the shareholders of Glaxo. And so the phrase I wanted to share with you, which my friend Nick Robbins came up with, he said, the shareholders of Glaxo were made aware that they were confronting a moral hazard of biblical proportions. कि कितना तुमको पाप चढ़ेगा. And then finally that worked, and Glaxo backed off. Not completely, but it compromised. And then of course many things have been happening, there is that differential pricing and all those, and there's a lot of information available. I have not gone into the details of it for a while, but it is possible to work out ways for the very legitimate need to recover your costs, and yet also not make the invention unreachable to 99.99% of people on earth. That's one. The other is that why shouldn't there be public funding for research? After all, what our friend, the Xerox inventor, did when he created Palo Alto, it was not public in the sense that they did it out of the private profits of a private company, but the result was public, na? In the same way that we have seen, at least my parents' generation has seen, how well public hospitals functioned, at least in Bombay, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So it's not like it cannot be done. They have declined. For that, But instead of addressing the reasons for the decline, if we argue that, this never works, the publicly funded, publicly managed institution always fails, that is not. So in Maharashtra, the Rajiv Gandhi Health Yojana is able to operate through private hospitals. And he says it works beautifully. The hospital does get its money from the government after the case. But here's the catch. The number of people who are availing of that scheme, who come in big expensive cars. What Dr. Inamdar, the owner of that hospital, he has been famously doing these angioplasties and angiographies and even bypasses for like 1/4 of what it costs to do it if you do it in Bombay. So apparently one day some big cardiologist from Bombay called him to protest कि यार तू क्यों मार्केट खराब कर रहा है? So apparently Dr. Inamdar said to him, look, this is what my market can bear, number one. In this place where I am, this is all that people can afford, otherwise they will not do their bypass. And besides, he says, I still have 2 Mercedes, so where is the problem? What is the tussle for us in India? And it's a very deep political battle, in which of course one side you could say has already comprehensively lost, which is the Gandhian version of what is the ideal human location, to him it's the village, and the Ambedkarite position that the village is the location for all the caste oppression, and the movement into the city, into the urban, and the breaking of the traditional systems as a whole is what will bring liberation to the Dalits and the other oppressed castes. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was a network of activists called Jan Vikas Andolan. And as a part of that network, we made an attempt to have a dialogue with Dalit activists on environment and the future of development. So we had 2 of these discussions, and the net outcome was very simple and kind of, it was quite expected from before, but as one, I'll actually quote one of the activists who said, you are worried about the forest? Great, you go live in the forest. We are going to move to the cities. We know we will live in slums for 1 or maybe 2 generations, but in 2 generations we will be middle class and we will move out of the slum. So please don't romanticize this rural and village and green to us. You're worried about the environment, you go and save it. We are going to move, because to us the city is the location of liberation. And that's factually the case, right? And Gandhi's village, as he repeatedly kept saying, when Nehru and everybody else made, not fun of him, but rejected what he was saying, he said, but the village I am talking about doesn't exist anywhere. It's like that Euclid's line. It's an ideal. We have to aspire for it. Issue is not rural versus urban, actually. It is about things that are human scale, firstly. So there can be urban that is human scale, and there can be rural that is not human scale. By human scale, I mean where there is still a sense of agency in a humane context for the individual and the collective, where you don't feel completely overwhelmed by circumstances that are beyond your control, which is in fact the situation today, for example, for most residents of metropolitan cities, right? You feel you're inside something over which you have no control. Okay, you can improve your footpath, you can improve garbage collection, you can do, wet, dry garbage, but what are you going to do about the air you breathe? Comprehensively, we are finding that we are not able to address it. So the moment it has crossed the human scale, and by human scale, I must emphasize, I also mean coherent communities. So for example, even in an urban or metro context, I live in a building with 20 flats. It is a community only so long as we are able to have civil communication between the 20 members and agree on certain things and implement them. Right? Otherwise, it all falls apart. There will be no garbage collected, there will be no sweeping of the common areas, etc., or repair of the building. So, the issue here is coherence of the collective, that people have a sense that, okay, as individuals and collectives, we can do something. The negative outcomes of what Gandhi had predicted are very much in our face. On that, I hope we can agree. Because otherwise, there would not be this influx to cities, I mean. Now, many people say, what is wrong with this influx? Why are you so upset? You third, fourth generation city dweller, you are just trying to selfishly save the city for yourself. That is why you are opposed to these people coming from outside. How many people know about the pavement dwellers case? 1981. It's a major case now in what do they call international case law in Commonwealth countries. So a friend of mine, she was actually my boss after that, during that time while the case was going on, Olga Tellis, a journalist. She was a senior correspondent for Telegraph in Bombay. She filed a writ petition. In those days, this was a new thing, that if you write a postcard to the judge and he makes it into a PIL, public interest litigation. There were some very brutal evictions of pavement dwellers in Bombay during the monsoon. So, Olga and a few lawyer friends sent a PIL, I mean they sent a letter to the judge saying, yeah, what is happening here? You have to do something to stop this, and that judge was a very interesting man, Lentin. I was recently in a meeting to mark what 30 years of that case, or what 25 years of that case? Yeah, 25 years. Where the son of Justice Lentin was present and he spoke about, because Justice Lentin is no more. And what was the issue in that case? The petitioners were saying, these people have not come out of their desire to see the big lights or, see Amitabh Bachchan driving by. That's not why they are here. They are here out of survival. They have been pushed from their natural habitat because there isn't enough livelihood, enough water, enough education or housing. So they are pushed out of their desperation. They come to the city because they think that here there is more opportunity. The case went against the pavement dwellers because the Supreme Court, finally it went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that yes, this is an important issue. I mean, I don't take my word for it. I'm not sure of the exact wording of the order, but in a nutshell they said, you cannot claim the right to live on a pavement. There is a human issue here, there is a human rights issue here. But, so the reason I mentioned the pavement dwellers case is that I'm basically saying that the issue is not of rural versus urban when it comes to who got there first and therefore should now keep the other person out. That's not the perspective at all. Instead, the issue is what will give everybody a material existence of well-being. Now, normally this is seen only in the policy level, right? And of how to create jobs in rural areas so people will not come to the urban areas. My purpose here today has been to try to demonstrate that this issue is the underlying issue to this whole urban influx, or rather rural influx to urban, is the nature of the shift from bazaar to market. Now again I want to emphasize that they don't exist separately, they don't exist in silos. The bazaar and market, they are overlapping, they are competing, and to some extent bazaar culture is overwhelmed by market culture. That is true. And yet in the middle of the city, the urban metro market world, the bazaar thrives also. That is how and why it is in the urban with its large concentrations that many more people are able to survive. Like my friend, wo jo maine bola na, he was holding those 6 nimbus, one in each hand. Now why is he able to do that? Because of numbers. Because such a large volume of people are passing by that spot where he is standing, that if even a tiny fraction of them buy his nimbus, he can go home in a few hours. He cannot do that in a village. I mean, in a kind of village where the purchasing power is so low. Please look this up. It's available, I think, off the internet. Anubandh, Ilaben Bhatt ka book hai. In this, she is drawing on a concept that has been discussed a lot in the West, and there are many groups that are working on it, called 100-mile communities. The concept is that for all your essential things of everyday life, you source within the 100-mile radius, particularly food. So that doesn't mean that your computer, your laptop has to come necessarily from that 100-mile radius, but that your food and your clothing and your shelter needs, as much as possible, you try to do from within the 100-mile radius. Because again, whether it is urban or rural, there is a big question as to what is the benefit of my eating apples from California when there are perfectly good apples to be eaten in India. And the logic of the market is that if there is a buyer and a seller, why is anybody getting in the way? Let the apples come from California and let Indian apples go to California. I mean, it may not be happening that Indian apples are going to California, but in many cases, say wine for example, right, it happens. And I am not in favor of artificial constraints. I am not saying that we should start policing, but there can be ways of paying the real price for that Californian apple. So for example, the argument is that if this long distance transport were to be properly priced and taxed, then it would not be as attractive or as viable as it now seems. And this is not only an ecological issue, it is also an economic justice issue, because while the globalization of the last 20-30 years has allowed goods to freely flow, relatively freely, the reality is that what needed to be done in the same period, and we have known this since the term sustainable development was adopted, which is in Rio, at the Earth Summit in Rio, 1992, we have known that what needs to be rewarded in the international platforms is sustainable production. But we have not done that. Exactly the opposite has happened, that whatever can sell cheaply travels farther. So localization is an idea that, again, we can go back to Gandhi, but we don't have to. You can ignore completely if you like, if you think that, you know, Gandhi was living in some fantasy world, ऐसा कैसा हो सकता है. Let's look at the modern versions. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the sum total of all the schemes that government is promoting, that is pumping money into, and yet there is no rise in actual jobs in any meaningful sense, then the question that you have to confront is there any substitute for revitalizing the local economy? And that local economy will have different face and different challenges in the village, in the district headquarter, in the suburb of the metropolitan city, and in the heart of the metropolitan city. But it will have the same, I mean, only the details will change, the basic question will not change. And now some of this of course is determined by supply and demand. I am not saying that the reality of supply and demand should be ignored, or that in itself that is a problem. It is not, because that is a basic dynamic. The only question is, should it be what completely controls our life? And the challenge for people like yourselves who are working in the field and having engagement with the policy sphere is to constantly refine what specific interventions, what specific actions, both at the ground level and at the policy level, will lead to that revitalization of the local economy, which will to some extent use the dynamic of supply and demand in a positive way, but will also protect people from the sharp fluctuations